10 years, over 1,000 ships. The greatest warriors of the ancient world camped outside walls thick enough to shrug off an army. And in one single night, all of it ended, not with a battle, but with a gift. Today we're covering how 15 men, hidden in total darkness, brought down the most fortified city on Earth without breaking a single stone. Believe it or not, the trick almost failed, not because the plan was bad, but because the truth was screamed out loud and nobody wanted to hear it. So let's rewind to one very bad decision and one very beautiful woman. Troy sat on the coast of what's now northwestern Turkey, right at the mouth of the Dardanelles, basically the ancient world's most valuable toll booth. Every ship moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea had to pass under those walls. Whoever controlled Troy controlled the trade routes, the grain, the metal, the money, and Troy's walls weren't a poetic exaggeration. Archaeological digs at the site show fortifications rebuilt layer upon layer across centuries, some sections over 5 meters thick, with towers positioned to see an enemy coming from miles away. This wasn't a city you knocked over on a bad day. This was a city built specifically so nobody could. Then Paris, a prince of Troy, showed up in Sparta as a guest at King Menelaus's palace, ate his food, slept under his roof, and left with his wife, Helen, the most famous woman in the ancient world, and now the reason 1,000 ships were about to cross the sea. Guest goes to your house. Guest leaves with your spouse. That's not a scandal. That's the ancient world's worst home invasion, and everybody in the Mediterranean was about to hear about it. Big mistake, buddy. And here's the detail that makes it worse. Paris didn't just fall for Helen on his own. According to legend, he was put in an impossible position first, asked to judge a beauty contest between 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each one bribing him to pick her as the fairest. Hera offered political power over Europe and Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory in every battle he'd ever fight. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman alive. Paris, a mortal being asked to judge a goddess beauty pageant with 0 possible good outcomes, picked love. He picked Helen, and doomed his entire city in the process. Somewhere out there is a version of this story where Paris picks political power instead, and Troy is still standing today. Instead, we got a decade of war because one prince couldn't turn down a pretty face, and 3 furious goddesses who never forgot who didn't pick them. Here's the part people skip over. This war was never really about love. It was about a contract. Years before Paris ever set foot in Sparta, every king who'd courted Helen swore an oath. If anyone ever took her, all of them would go to war to bring her back. Think of it like a group chat where everyone agrees to show up for a friend's move, except instead of carrying boxes, it's ships, spears, and a decade of bloodshed. Menelaus called in that oath the second Helen was gone. His older brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, ambitious, ruthless, about as warm as a tax audit, took command of the entire coalition. Over 1,000 ships sailed for Troy, carrying tens of thousands of men from every corner of the Greek world, kings from Crete, from Sparta, from Ithaca, from Mycenae, all showing up because a piece of paper from years earlier said they had to. Not because everyone loved Helen, because everyone had signed the paperwork, and paperwork like that doesn't get ignored. But paperwork doesn't win wars. Soldiers do. And the Greeks were about to learn the hard way that Troy's walls weren't even the biggest problem they had. Because here's the part nobody puts on the recruiting poster. Troy wasn't fighting alone either. Allies poured in from across Anatolia and beyond to defend the city. Different languages, different customs, all united by one shared interest in not getting burned to the ground. This wasn't 2 armies. This was basically 2 entire regions of the ancient world, throwing everything they had at each other over a stolen wife and a broken promise. For 9 years, the Greeks camped on the beach outside Troy and got basically nowhere. 9 years. That's longer than most modern wars. Long enough for babies born at the start of the siege to grow up and pick up a spear by the end of it. The Greeks raided nearby towns for grain and cattle. They fought skirmishes under the walls. They watched good men die in a stalemate that refused to break, year after year, while back home their own kingdoms started falling apart without them. But then, in year 10, everything changed, and not because of a battle, because of an argument over a woman who wasn't even Helen. Agamemnon took a captive girl from his best fighter, Achilles, as a spoil of war, basically pulling rank to steal from the one guy holding the whole army together. Achilles, the greatest warrior alive, practically invincible, a walking war crime with a sword, got so furious he refused to fight. He didn't storm off. He didn't threaten mutiny. He just sat in his tent, sulked like the ancient world's most dangerous benched athlete. And without him, the Greeks started losing, badly. The Trojans, led by Prince Hector, genuinely the most decent human being in this entire story, a man fighting to protect his home rather than to steal someone else's wife, pushed the Greek lines all the way back toward their own ships, toward the ocean, toward total collapse. That's when Achilles' closest friend, Patroclus, begged to wear Achilles' armor into battle just to scare the Trojans into retreating. It worked, for a while, but Hector killed him, and that one death changed the entire war. Let's talk about Achilles for a second, because this is the part people always get wrong. Achilles wasn't a hero, he was a weapon with feelings, and honestly, that's so much more interesting. According to legend, his mother, the sea nymph Thetis, dipped him in the river Styx as a baby to make him invulnerable, except she held him by the heel, which never touched the water. The ancient world's single biggest oversight. One vulnerable spot on an otherwise unkillable man, and it's just his ankle. When Patroclus died, Achilles didn't grieve quietly. He went feral. He dragged himself out of his tent and reportedly screamed so loud the enemy froze in place at the sound of it. He went back to war not for glory, not for Greece, not even for Helen. For revenge. He hunted down Hector, killed him in single combat right outside Troy's own walls in full view of Hector's family, then tied the body to his chariot and dragged it around the city while Hector's father watched from the ramparts. That's not heroism, that's grief holding a sword. Rest easy, Hector. You didn't deserve any of this. But here's the irony almost nobody talks about. Achilles, the single most powerful warrior in the entire war, never lived to see it end. He died before the wooden horse was ever built, killed by an arrow to that one exposed heel, the only part of him that was ever human, the strongest man in the story, beaten by an ankle. Meanwhile, King Priam, Troy's ruler, an old man who had already buried more sons than anyone should have to, personally walked into the Greek camp at night, alone, to beg Achilles for his son's body back. Think about that. The king of the besieged city, no guards, no army, kneeling in his enemy's tent, kissing the hands of the man who killed his son. Achilles, for once, actually showed mercy. He gave the body back. Two grieving men, on opposite sides of a war neither of them started. Now compare that to Agamemnon, the man technically in charge of the entire Greek coalition. Where Achilles had rage and Hector had honor, Agamemnon had ego, the kind of leader who'd sacrifice literally anything, including at one point his own daughter, to keep the gods on his side and the war moving forward. He's the guy in every group project who takes credit for the work and blame for none of the failures. History remembers him as the commander who won Troy. It rarely mentions that he barely lifted a spear to do it, and that's exactly why Odysseus matters so much here. He wasn't royalty by ambition, and he wasn't chasing glory like Achilles. He just wanted to go home to his wife and son on Ithaca, a homesickness so famous it became an entire second epic on its own. He tried to fake insanity to avoid being drafted into this war in the first place, plowing a field with salt instead of seed to convince recruiters he'd lost his mind. It didn't work. They tested him by putting his infant son in front of the plow, and Odysseus swerved to avoid killing the baby, proving instantly that he was completely sane and now completely obligated to fight. 10 years later, that same reluctant family man would be the one clever enough to end the entire war without another decade of bloodshed. After 10 years, after Achilles, after Hector, after tens of thousands dead on both sides, the Greeks finally admitted something devastating. They were never going to take these walls by force. Not with more soldiers, not with more time, not ever. So Odysseus, king of Ithaca, not the strongest, not the fastest, but easily the smartest man on that beach, came up with a plan so insane it just might work. Build a giant wooden horse, hollow it out, hide soldiers inside. Ancient sources disagree on the exact number, ranging anywhere from a couple dozen up to 40. but many tellings settle on a small, tight squad of around 15 men crammed shoulder to shoulder in total darkness, barely able to breathe for hours. Burned the camp to the ground, sailed the entire fleet just far enough away to disappear from view, as if the whole army had finally given up and sailed home. The man who actually built the thing was a soldier named Odysseus, not a legendary fighter, not a famous name like Achilles or Ajax, just a skilled craftsman who, by his own admission in some tellings, wasn't much good in a straight fight. And there's something almost poetic about that. After 10 years of the strongest men in the world failing to break Troy with muscle, the war was finally decided by a carpenter with a good set of tools and steady hands. Wood was reportedly stripped from the sacred grove on nearby Mount Ida, shaped, joined, and hollowed out large enough to hide a small unit of armed men standing upright, in full armor, for what would be an entire night and day of waiting, and leave behind one man. A soldier named Sinon, deliberately abandoned on the beach, whose entire job was to get captured and lie. When the Trojans found him, Sinon put on the performance of his life. He claimed the Greeks had turned on him, that they'd meant to sacrifice him to the gods for safe passage home, and that he'd escaped and hidden in the marshes. He told them the horse was an offering to the goddess Athena, deliberately built too massive to fit through Troy's gates, because, he explained, if the Trojans destroyed it, they'd bring down divine wrath on themselves, but if they somehow got it inside their walls, Troy would become unconquerable forever. One lie, wrapped inside a threat, wrapped inside a flattering prophecy. Odysseus didn't just build a trap, he built a story people wanted to believe, and it worked. A priest named Laocoon wasn't buying any of it. He warned the crowd outright, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he said, and honestly, name a truer sentence ever spoken in human history. He even threw a spear at the horse's flank, and witnesses swore they heard it echo hollow, like something was hiding inside. Cassandra, a Trojan princess cursed by the god Apollo to always tell the truth and never once be believed, said the exact same thing. Word for word basically, burn it, don't trust it, it's a trap. Nobody listened. Instead, the Trojans threw a party. They dragged the horse through their own gates, a gate so narrow they had to tear down part of their own wall just to fit it through. Think about that for a second. The wall that had protected them for 10 straight years, the single most valuable piece of engineering in their entire city, and they personally demolished a chunk of it with their own hands to bring the enemy inside for free. That night, drunk on wine and the belief that the war was finally over, Troy went to sleep. And in the belly of that horse, 15 men sat frozen in the dark, listening to an entire city celebrate its own destruction, waiting for total silence. Nobody knew yet. Here's the part that should be in every heist movie ever made. The plan almost failed. Multiple times, in multiple ways. According to some versions of the story, Helen herself, yes, that Helen, walked around the horse late at night with the Greek commander Menelaus' own men watching, and called out to the hidden soldiers in the exact voices of their individual wives back home. One by one, mimicking each man's own household, trying to trick someone, anyone, into answering and blowing the whole operation. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed wrong. Odysseus reportedly had to physically clamp a hand over one soldier's mouth just to keep him from responding to a voice that sounded exactly like his own wife calling his name in the dark. The most heavily fortified city on Earth had every warning sign a civilization could possibly get. A priest begging them to burn it. A princess with a flawless track record of correctly predicting doom. A spear that rang hollow when it struck the wood. And still, they dragged it inside their gates and toasted to victory. That's the twist. Troy wasn't tricked because the trick itself was flawless. Troy was tricked because after 10 years of grinding, exhausting war, they wanted so badly to believe it was finally over that they ignored every single person who told them the truth. Sometimes the deadliest weapon in history isn't cunning, it's exhaustion. In the dead of night, once the celebration had gone completely silent, the soldiers climbed down out of the horse. They opened the gates from the inside, and the Greek fleet, which had only ever pretended to sail away, came roaring back onto the beach under cover of darkness. Troy burned that night. A city that had stood for generations, that had absorbed an entire decade of siege from the greatest army in the ancient world without ever falling, was gone by sunrise. Not because the walls failed, because the people behind them opened the door themselves. King Priam, the old man who once knelt in an enemy's tent to beg for his son's body, reportedly died that same night at his own household altar. Cassandra, the princess nobody ever believed, was dragged from a temple that was supposed to be sacred ground. Whatever mercy still existed in this war ran out the moment those gates swung open. That's the part edutainment videos sometimes rush past, and it shouldn't be rushed past. A 10-year war didn't end with a clean victory lap. It ended with a massacre, because that's what wars actually do when they finally end. And it worked. After 10 years, after Achilles, after Hector, after Priam kneeling in the dark for a body, it worked. That's the part that still gets me, honestly. All those years, all that bloodshed, walls thick enough to laugh off a 10-year siege, undone in a single night, by around 15 guys, some very good acting, and one story people wanted so badly to be true. The Trojan War teaches something that has nothing to do with ancient Greece and everything to do with us, right now. The strongest defenses in the world don't fail from the outside. They fail the moment the people behind them stop asking questions. Troy didn't lose because the Greeks were stronger. Troy lost because it wanted to believe the war was over more than it wanted to know the truth. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If you were standing on those walls that night, watching your own city drag a mysterious gift through your own gates while your own priestess stood there screaming that it was a trap, would you have listened? Or would you have wanted to believe, like everyone else, that it was finally over? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to see what happened after the fires went out, what happened to Odysseus, who spent another 10 brutal years just trying to get home to the family he left behind, that's next. It's a story about monsters, gods, and a man who just wants to go home, and it might be even wilder than this one. If you love history that feels less like a textbook and more like something that actually happened to actual, flawed, terrified, brilliant people, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.